Women and girls make up a disproportionate amount of the victims of war and fragility. At the same time, women can also be agents of change and play a key role in building peaceful and sustainable societies. But in many of the world's most fragile societies, there are numerous barriers to women being empowered to participate actively in peace-building efforts and to build better lives for their families and communities. The review that we're launching today, with generous support from BMZ, is looking at the evidence on programs to address some of these barriers. The review is the result of a year-long effort by a large team of researchers from 3IE and colleagues at the Africa Centre for Evidence. Managed by Etienne Luamba, Research Associate at 3IE, and with technical leadership from Shannon Schisler, the team also includes Maytal Kempfer, Will Riddlehoover, Lawrence Langer, Nkululeko Chabalala, and Promise Nduku, among others. So Etienne will present some of the key findings of the review shortly, and this will then be followed by a panel discussion and audience Q&A. To offer their reflections on the review, we are lucky to have 4 distinguished panelists. We have Henriette Saxe, Senior Advisor of the Department of Transitional Development Assistance at BMZ. We have Jana Nojoks, Head of Programs at Inclusive Peace. Then we have Naila Kabir, Joint Professor of Gender and International Development at the London School of Economics, and Sarah Nibbs, Deputy Regional Director at the UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. So with that, I'll hand over to Etienne to share the main findings with us.
Thank you, Berta. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully everyone can see the presentation. Berta, can you guys see it?
Yep, all good.
Thank you. So I'm really delighted to present the results and findings of the systematic review, Strengthening Women's Empowerment and Gender Equality in Fragile Context Towards Peaceful and Inclusive Society. I will call this systematic review the Gender SR for this presentation, because as you can see, the title is quite long. So as Birte explained, this review has been commissioned by BMZ's Transitional Development Assistance and led by the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation in partnership with the Africa Centre for Evidence. The findings I have the chance to present today are the result of about 1 year of research with my colleagues Maytal, Shannon, Will, Lawrence, Promise, and Nkululeko. If we look first at the background of this review, so our review starts from actually an alarming observation. And this observation is that 23% of the world population lives in fragile and conflict-affected situations. 50% of this population is composed by women, and over 75% of those women in FCAS live in extreme poverty. Despite this situation, the proportion of bilateral aid to women's empowerment in FCAS as a principal objective of programs is quite low, 6%, as you can see on this presentation. So this is partly due to the high number of crises affecting women worldwide in countries such as Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Uganda, Ethiopia, which are the main recipients of aid on women's empowerment and gender equality. So from this observation emerged some questions. What works? What works to empower the women in fragile settings? How this empowerment contributes to peace? And how can women be actors of change in fragile and conflict-affected situations, FCAS? So our team was far from being the first one to raise the question. And in 2000, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 claimed that women and girls are target of war, they are particularly vulnerable in fragile contexts, and they are affected both by fragility and conflict in unique ways. So this major resolution doesn't only recognizes the vulnerability of women in FCAS, but it also recognizes their role in building peace and stability through 4 pillars, the first one being participation, second one, prevention, protection, and then recovery and relief. So this framework and the subsequent women, peace and security agenda has been at the foundation of our systematic review. So to set the boundaries and scope of our review, we have applied the PICOS approach that allows to define the criteria for inclusion and exclusion of in our analysis. So in terms of population, we looked at all genders of all age at the individual and community level in FCAS. In terms of intervention and comparison, we looked only at gender-specific and gender-transformative interventions. So those interventions that address the causes of gender-based inequities and include ways to transform harmful gender norms, roles, and relations. In terms of outcomes, we look at outcomes based on the 3 dimensions of women's empowerment that has been actually defined by one of our panelists here, Neila Kabir, who would probably be able to provide more information if you have any question. But looking at those 3 dimensions that are resources, agency, and achievement, all contributing to empowerment. Finally, we looked at studies using rigorous impact evaluation methods completed by linked impact evaluation papers and/or qualitative documentation. So to provide you with an overview of our gender SR, we have screened over 100,000 papers at title and abstract, and about 1,500 at full text. And this screening resulted in 104 studies completed by 36 linked impact evaluation papers and 90 linked qualitative papers. This evidence base is actually analyzing the impact of 14 types of intervention from 55 programs in 29 fragile and conflict-affected situations. All this evidence has also been reviewed using the grade methodology that assesses the certainty of evidence. So now if we look at some of our results of search, first looking at the map and the geographical spread of our systematic review, we see that most of the studies are actually located on the Africa continent, Southeast Asia, and some in Latin America. An interesting aspect of our review has been to look at fragility at the community level by both looking at the national categorization of FCAS, but also considering some local situations of fragility, such as refugee camps, slums, etc. Another interesting aspect is the relative gap of rigorous evidence in the MENA region that we would have expected to be a key region of focus. So although studies are implemented in the region, only a few of them actually use rigorous methodologies and/or have this gender-specific or transformative lens. Looking now at the types of intervention we analyzed, our list of intervention both looks at intervention focusing on women's empowerment in FCAS, but also on involving women as actors of peace and stabilization. We can see that the number of studies actually varies between the 14 types of intervention, from 19 unique studies in cash transfer to 1 in community-based services. So in terms of the intervention we looked at cash transfers, life, social, and livelihood skills and capacity building, asset transfer, self-help group, sensitization campaign, TVET, inclusive community-driven development, safe spaces, discussion groups, institutional provisions of loans and savings, community dialogues and reconciliation, all-women police station quotas, and community-based services. So this diversity of amount of evidence also explains why, in terms of qualitative analysis, we have only been able to do it on 8 of the 14 interventions due to a lack of qualitative evidence on some of the intervention groups. And meta-analysis on the quantitative side has been conducted on 11 types of intervention. So one of my key challenges today is to summarize the 500 pages of our report full of findings in a few minutes. So we have identified some of the key findings we wanted to share with you today. The first one is that most of the intervention have a significant positive effect on the outcome closely related to the purpose of the intervention. And we actually don't find any of the 14 interventions that bear significantly negative results on any measured outcomes. So we then see interventions such as cash transfer bearing positive results on outcomes such as access to income and savings, community-driven development improving political representation and participation, sensitization campaign improving trust and self-confidence. However, and it's our second point today, most interventions fail to achieve positive and significant effect for downstream behavioral outcomes. So this is particularly visible on an outcome such as intimate partner violence, where although it is often targeted by interventions, they often fail to bear significantly positive effect on it. One source of explanation of this limitation might be related to the multidimensional effect of empowerment we have seen talking about resources, agency, and achievement. Only a few interventions actually have a positive effect across the three dimensions. And those intervention types are cash transfer, self-help groups, and TVET. Another source of explanation of the limitation of this observation, of the limitation of effect, is the importance of norms and restrictive social context that can act as a barrier to empowerment. So a key illustration of this phenomenon is observable on the TVET, so Technical Vocational Education and Training, intervention where we observe a significant and positive effect on skills and knowledge, but no significant effect on access to jobs. So it means that TVET is actually creating the skills, but that those skills are not always converted into access to employment. Finally, we observe major differences in the impact of intervention depending on the targeting and design. Targeting the right level of vulnerability, the right beneficiaries, can be a key driver of success. So what are the implications of those findings? So first, sorry, if you focus on implications for project design and implementation, well, we have seen that gender, patriarchal, and social norms can limit the impact of the intervention. It is then necessary for programs to adjust for this restrictive context and not only target beneficiaries, but also work on opening the doors that will make this change sustainable. The second point is that women are not an homogeneous group, even at the local level. So targeting women in X, Y, or Z region is not enough. Program needs to target the right beneficiaries, and this will come through a detailed analysis of the context, a detailed analysis of the stakeholders, needs assessment, baseline analysis that will minimize this selection error, but also maximize trust and lead to an impactful program. In this effort of targeting and being mindful of restrictive context, working with local powers and institutions appear as a no-brainer. These actors are both enablers of action, but they will also improve the legitimacy while reducing the backlash by being embedded in your programs. Another point is that studies show that social capital and exchange are key resources to maximize impact. And the integration of the program at the community level is an important point. So program can rely on peer-to-peer exchange, on the use of local role model to also increase this trust and impact. Last but not least, empowerment should also not be considered as a side effect or a potential outcome. If you want empowerment to happen in your program, well, you need to target it specifically and tailor your program to target the specific empowerment outcomes. We have seen that empowerment is actually a multidimensional concept. So the program itself in its design needs to take this into account, targeting maybe resources, agency, achievement, but also specific outcomes within those categories to build the theory of change. Now moving to the implication for research, I can't tell how many different gender indices and frameworks we had to look at over the course of this research. And my teammates here will probably be able to testify as well. So there is a numerous, like a high amount of different ways to measure gender. And so there is this need for a set of standardized indicators that will allow comparison between intervention, between situation, between context, especially at the local and community level. And that's a similar observation that we have made in regards to measuring fragility and basically classifying FCAS. some countries would be classified as FCAS by some frameworks indices and not on others. But in general, we observe that there is no existing index to categorize fragility at the local or community level. So this is a route research can take. Another element is that there are still some gaps in research, and especially rigorous impact evaluations. We have both identified geographical gaps, I mentioned earlier the MENA region, but also thematic gaps, such as intervention focusing on the specific role of women as agent of peace. An example I can give is that we have identified 104 studies for this systematic review, but that seems actually as a lot, but there are also a lot of papers that we have excluded due to the fact that they are not using rigorous approaches, or to the fact that they are not gender specific or only disaggregating data between gender. So even more can be done, and we really encourage to work on those rigorous impact evaluation on those topics. Another element is that our research on social aspects demonstrate the added value of mixed methods in impact evaluation. The quantitative method will allow us to say what works and what doesn't, but the qualitative will add this value on why it works, why it doesn't work, how can we make it work better, and has really been an added value for our analysis. And the last point I will make today in terms of implication is that many studies were looking at the impact of programs in less than 2 years after its completion. If we want to look at longer term impact of programs, well, we need to be able to expand this follow-up period to be able then to analyze what has been the sustainable impact, or is the impact of this intervention sustainable? So this was a quick overview of our systematic review. I obviously invite you to have a look at our report available on the 3IE website, or our summary of findings if you want to have more detail. And my colleague Eda will be happy to address any of your questions in the chat or during the Q&A. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Etienne, for a very nice and clear presentation, and for managing to get through all of that in a very short space of time. If I can then invite Henriette to offer your reflections on the review.
Well, thanks a lot, Berthe, and hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. Hello from Berlin. Well, let me start with a big thank you very much for Berthe and her team for conveying this systematic review and presenting us the findings today. I mean, as we realized and was presented to us already, it's a huge study, and 500 pages, I guess, will need to be examined and be read. So it's amazing, and we are very grateful that you took on this task. So and I also want to say that we are very excited to start in-depth dialogue now, as of today, in discussing the results and the findings, and transform those findings into something concrete. And that is why it's so interesting for us to see and to discuss these issues and findings with you, because of course we want to take them in our policy, and we want to reflect them in our further policy development. So my name is Henriette Sachse, and I'm working here at the BMZ at the division of the Transitional Development Assistance. This is one of our BMZ's major crisis instrument, TDA. This is Transitional Development Assistance, TDA. Is working in about 30 countries, and at the moment we are running a 3.5 billion portfolio of about 250 running programs. Our main partners are UNICEF, the World Food Programme, NGOs, GIZ, KfW. So we have a lot of very competent partners in these crisis contexts. And we are very much interested in the topic of today, gender equality and women's empowerment, because this is also of the heart of our strategy of transitional development assistance. And of course, as the German federal government, we are also very much involved in the implementation of the plan for the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So that is why the BMZ is really interested in those findings, and specifically in this systematic review. In your presentation, you mentioned already that some intervention types are found most promising, like, as you mentioned, cash transfers, or self-help groups, village and loan associations, or technical and vocational education and training. And these three types of interventions are happily, I might say, are all in our portfolio already. And that this is very how you say, this is very confirming for us. So that is the right way to go. And especially, I don't know whether you follow the discussion in Germany and German politics, maybe, I don't know, for the last 10 years, especially when it comes to cash transfers. There was a lot of discussions going on whether this would be the right way, and whether cash transfers is the is the right way to get involved, especially in crisis context. So this is why I'm especially happy that the findings are so strong, that cash is a very good way, especially here, to also strengthen gender equality and women's empowerment. And well, of course, also here we at TDA, Transitional Development Assistance, we have a lot of cash programs in more than 18 countries with more than 25 organizations. We work conditional as well as unconditional, of course. And the same applies to TVET. I mean, technical and vocational education and training has always been a very strong pillar at the German German development policy. So, and again, this is also very confirming that it's, this is the right way to go. Well, I might just stop here for the introduction. Thanks again, and I'm very happy to join in with all the other panelists. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Henriette. If I can ask Jana to follow.
Hello, everybody. Let me start by congratulating 3IE for completing this really monumental major review effort that is a really helpful production of insights to the policymakers and practitioners working at the intersection of peace and promoting of gender equality in those places where they're lacking the most. I think that's really useful to have the bulk of the evidence, some very clear takeaways. For me as a practitioner, sort of 15 years with prior to Inclusive Peace, peacebuilding organization International Alert, working on gender equality, women's empowerment in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. It chimed a lot with the experience of trying to support projects in different fragile contexts, where we found again and again that the programming to support income-generating activities worked great at raising income, but then sometimes had unexpected side effects, such as a program focusing on supporting women's income in Uganda, northern Uganda, among displaced women. But the program then found a very unexpected increase in domestic violence from male stakeholders in those camps that weren't being taken into account. So we know there's very good methods for achieving single issues, but without looking at the bigger picture of negative potential consequences in these restrictive contexts that need to be taken into account. What came up as well is other projects focused on political empowerment very successfully. But while they were very successful at increasing women's political empowerment at the local level, when you then try to scale this up to the regional level or to the national level, it runs into a glass ceiling very quickly when there isn't the economic foundation for these women. If basic livelihood, economic survival of the household is an issue, you can't level up participation to national level decision making, even if the skills are there, the interest is there. So it's to me, this review really emphasized the point that you need to have linked up, joined up approaches tackling these various components of empowerment in order to really make a significant difference in fragile and conflict affected states. Part of that is also recognizing, which is one of the recommendations as well, of working with local power holders and institutions, and really that it cannot be assumed that projects that work on economic empowerment or political empowerment automatically have an impact on the broader gender equality, the change in social norms in those contexts, and that every project that tries to support gender equality broader needs to have a sustained and planned approach for working with male stakeholders, working with husbands, working with male leaders, religious leaders, in order to avoid negative backlash or to avoid a lack of impact and change. You can tweak the little components, but if you don't have a strategic approach for working at the broader social norm narrative in these contexts, it will have limited impacts. And yeah, another reflection on this is that there's often emphasis on working with the poorest of the poor or the most marginalized, which is fantastic, as that where the most support is needed, but also a word of caution of not overburdening then the programming to focus on these stakeholders, expecting it to level up to a very large degree on creating peace in the country, these kind of provide a chicken here to these women in need, and then we will result in more peaceful countries at the national level. So we really need to think, so I very much echo that call for a more targeted design of stakeholders, looking at sort of the broader stakeholder mapping, who we're influencing, who we're trying to encourage in acting, in reaching higher levels of stakeholders, and providing that basic socioeconomic support at the grassroots to enable the participation in that. So I think I will leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. Naila, can I ask you to come in?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for inviting me on this panel. And an amazing piece of work, a lot of evidence there. I have three, I think maybe two or three points. I think my first point is about the fact of, one of the points you all made is that the barriers to realizing the kinds of impact you're looking for are very often these social constraints and norms and so on. But of course they are. I mean, one of the reasons that we're trying to empower women is precisely because there are these barriers. So in a sense, that is the nature of the problem. And I think in trying to overcome that, you've come up with, I think, ideas around, on the one hand, social embedding, getting community leaders, religious leaders on board. And this is what Jana was talking about, minimizing backlash. But on the other hand, you also talk about mentorship and so on. So I think, when it's what I think of as the dilemma of countercultural change. You're trying to bring about change that goes against the grain of local culture and goes against the grain of patriarchy. At the same time, on the one hand, you're wanting some of the holders of patriarchal power to be on your side to bring about this change, which is necessary because of gaining legitimacy. But that is immediately going to have a dampening impact on what you're able to achieve, because they will slow down change. So I'm sort of thinking that there are two forms of social capital, if you like, coming through the review. One is the vertical social capital, people in power, etc. But the other, which I think is very important, is the horizontal social capital. To what extent can these interventions build into them peer groups, self-help groups, social networks, mentoring, all the things that help people who are trying to overcome these barriers have the collective strength to do so. And to what extent can that be done alongside trying to get the legitimacy that you want by bringing in religious leaders and so on? I mean, I understand the problem on the ground, but it always sort of troubles me that we're trying to ask the gatekeepers of patriarchal power to help us open up the gates. So I think it's somehow, how do we balance, the need for legitimacy and the need for people with a stake in change? I think my second point is around the kind of impacts that you've laid out, and you've done a very comprehensive job in this review of looking at all these three dimensions and resources, agency, and empowerment. But for the reader, sometimes you get a bit depressed because you say, oh, they achieved this and this and this, but they didn't achieve that and that and that and that, right? And you think, well, actually, perhaps we might want not so much to classify impacts along the three different dimensions, but in terms of their potential for change, the transformative nature of change. So very quick example, I would make a big distinction between changing attitudes and changing behavior. Anybody can say, oh, I don't think women should be beaten, but until women stop getting beaten, we don't really have an impact, right? So I think, so in one place you talk about community-driven development, and the only impact it had was political participation. And I thought, my goodness, if you had political participation, that counts for a lot. But we want to know, how genuine was this political participation? Was it just attending meetings? Was it speaking? Was it challenging local cultures? So I think it'd be quite useful for the funders and policymakers to review the full range of impacts and have them in order of priority in terms of which are the ones that are most likely to lead to some kind of sustainable change. And I wouldn't say that each of these three dimensions are inextricably linked. I think empowerment requires change in one dimension to lead to change in the others, right? So it requires changes in resources to lead to changes in agency, or to lead in changes in achievements, or changes in achievements could lead to changes in resources. So I don't think there's an inextricable relationship. I think what you're trying to do is build interventions that try and make those links come alive. And in the end, it is the achievements that we're looking at. What were the outcomes of improvements in resources and so on? So I'll end there. And I had one other point, and that is really following up from Henrietta. You said that it really validates the fact that these are the interventions that provide the most. I was very impressed with the self-help groups. I thought the village loans and savings, they seem to have the most significant and consequential impacts, right? But I think others had lots and lots of impacts. But I also see that some interventions are barely studied at all. So the review is biased towards precisely those interventions which have been popular, right? And which therefore show the most impacts, because they have been most studied. So I think one needs to investigate, women-only police stations and some of the others that have been neglected, to see if they prove to have more than we have seen in this study. I'm not saying they do. I'm just saying it's important, not to sort of cluster around one or two interventions, but to look for the less studied interventions and more difficult to study interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Naila. Very helpful. And Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm really honoured to have the opportunity to be in this panel, and it's been very exciting to listen to the results of this study. It's so comprehensive, and I think, like any really interesting collection of findings, it's like just brings up so many questions as well as telling us so much, and I think there's so many more things to explore, so it's really great to have the opportunity to reflect. I think probably like like many of the panelists, I'm also listening and listening through the lens, of course, of listening through the filter of the work that we do, and thinking how it relates to sort of experiences that we're having at UN Women with our work in the field. And I think one of the things, perhaps following on a little bit from Naila was mentioning, it would be really interesting, I think, to understand a little bit more about the community-driven development, because I think this is one of the areas where where, for example, some partners we have are attempting quite complex and profound change. But of course, we, even as an organization working with donors, you know, we run into all these frustrations all the time about measuring things and how you talk about it and what's really happened, and can you look at stories of change and can you draw from those, or can you be more you know, quantitative. So I would really love to see if we can explore more of those areas, because I think we have probably put a lot of faith in those kinds of interventions, and it would be very interesting to have more evidence. Secondly, I think something that came where I had a lot of questions and reflections when I was listening to the findings was also around the role of the women's movement and of women's organizations, because it was really interesting to hear that, and very, very heartening, I thought as well, to hear some of the findings around work that was done by groups of women. Because when we talk about, you know, things like self-help groups and village savings and loans, as much as we talk about those interventions, what we hope is that they're community, they become community initiatives among women, where women are supporting one another. So I think in that regard, I think one of the things for all of us to think about is how we can really support women's movements and women's voice and women's agency in this space. And of course, that, you know, we know that's a profound part of the agenda of Youth Security Council Resolution 1325. And I just wanted to maybe just to finish just with one reflection. I was also looking at the discussions that were happening last week, you know, around the open debate on women, peace and security. And in fact, when our executive director of UN Women was addressing that gathering, she was talking about the fact that only 0.4% of the funding that's going into these kind of contexts is actually going to feminist, women-centered, women-led organizations, while 80% of those organizations are often struggling with funding. So I was just wondering, you know, one of the things I want to take away from this conversation and reflect on more is thinking about how, you know, we can make the connection between evidence and you know, the case for the engagement of those organizations. So thank you so much, and back to you, Berta.
Thank you. So I'll perhaps at the end, do you want to offer some responses to some of the comments from the panel? And then we'll do a round of questions to the whole panel.
Sure. Well, I would need maybe an hour, but I won't take the hour. I will just take a few minutes. But I think just a few points that I've heard and I think are very relevant is this point about behavior and attitudes, and that's really something that we have also seen in our papers, where those papers measuring, okay, amount of participation in X, Y, or Z council or committee. So that's what the quantitative will bring. But that's why also it's interesting to bring the mixed method, as I said earlier, because the qualitative will also give us the details. Okay, so they participate, but in what aspect do they participate? Can they actually speak during those meetings? Can they participate in the decision? And you will realize that from one intervention to another, the participation, so the attitude is not enough. The behavior needs to change. And that's also especially relevant for, as we presented earlier, those points about gender norms. So some examples that we have encountered in our papers, and if I use the example of cash transfer, they would provide the cash transfer to women. But if they provide the cash transfer to women, but the women don't have actually the decision-making power at the household level, who will be the person taking care of the cash being transferred? Well, that would be the man of the house, either the husband or the son, or whoever it is. So if we really want to have sustainable change, there is this need always, not only to work on the actual outcome that we want, like providing cash, providing income, but how this outcome can be transformed into a sustainable change and impact. So as we said, the attitudes and behavior. And in one element that helps, and I think it's also addressing one of the points from another member of the panel, is this peer-to-peer, this work with the community, and not only targeting women. It's not because it's gender specific or gender transformative that it's only targeting women. It actually needs to involve the other members of the community, so they change their gender, not only attitude, but behavior. towards women or any gender groups. So just to respond in a few minutes to all the interesting points being raised by the members of the panel.
Thanks, Etienne. So there are a couple of questions from the audience that I'd like to pose to our panel. So Emily Brown is saying, from a feminist perspective, I find it really interesting that none of the promising approaches you found in the review engage with the structural root causes of gender inequalities or indeed conflict. We know from the growing body of evidence about the impact of women's participation in decision-making at the local level in FCAS, and she's referring to a study. Would love to hear the panel's thoughts on what you saw and found in relation to structural and institutional change in support of gender equality. So that's one question. Another one is from Alice Fox, which is asking in the context of COVID. We know COVID is a great widow maker. Marginalized, invisible widows accused of witchcraft and blamed for deaths of their husbands. This leaves communities and husbands, male relatives, free to appropriate widows' home and property, leaving her and her children vulnerable to forced migration and trafficking, slavery, forced marriage, etc. How can we work to engage with men in those fragile, impoverished communities to change perceptions? And finally, a related question from Alice. Can I ask this amazing group to endorse the need to include marital status in any disaggregated data gathering? So perhaps we can go in the same order as we had the first contributions from the panels, and maybe Henrietta, do you want to respond to any of those questions?
Well, actually, I'm not sure whether the questions are not going to Etienne at some point, because I haven't read the study yet, so I guess especially the questions regarding the study and what you found, I would hand over to Etienne instead.
I'm happy.
Etienne? Yeah.
I'm happy to start, and maybe the other members of the panels will want to react or add on my response. So I will try to address the question. So the first one regarding the structural and institutional change in support of gender equality. So definitely, that's an important aspect, and that's also one of the reasons why we have insisted in our implication on involving thought leaders, involving local institutions, involving local authorities. Because at the end of the day, if any of the intervention wants to have a longer term impact, these type of actors needs to be fully engaged in the intervention. Because they are the ones who will bring the legitimacy to the intervention, and they're also the ones who are going to basically enable the process. So that's also referring to what I said earlier about interventions that are gender specific or gender transformative don't have to be only targeting women. They have to be actually targeting the whole community in different ways to engage them in this transformational change. That's also, I think, partly addressing another of the questions about engaging with other actors. And that's what also we have looked at in our intervention. I will take an example, which is the example of discussion groups. So we have seen in the discussion groups intervention types that we have in discussion groups among women, but we also have men discussion groups that are actually driving change as Neila highlighted earlier, not only in terms of attitudes, saying, I don't think it's right to be violent at home with my wife or with my daughter, but actually checking, is this change of attitude leading to a change of behavior? And that once again brings this relation of saying, and sorry if I repeat myself, but I think it's an important point, that change in gender-specific, gender-transformative intervention can not only target women. They need to target other members of the communities that will enable this sustainable change. So I hope it addresses those two questions, and maybe the other members of the panel want to add to what I just said, and hopefully I'm addressing the question. If not, happy to elaborate.
Do anyone from the panel want to comment on those questions?
I'll comment on the one on I think women's movements and so on. And I think the reason that this review didn't capture that kind of literature is that that kind of literature doesn't lend itself to a what works framework. You know, what works frameworks, the kind of thing that goes into systematic reviews, tend to be small, very often individual focused, or maybe a group focused. They tend to be a lot of RCTs, and therefore they're very small scale. You know, they can't do the big stuff. Whereas I think if you went for large scale surveys, which were observational, you might be able to capture over time some of the changes that have happened. I have been asking BRAC in Bangladesh, you know, if we could go back to some of the people that they worked with, you know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, and see if their daughters have a different life course, you know, because the mothers were engaged in, you know, self-help groups or microfinance and so on. So I think we need to have a slightly historical perspective, because I think I think it's Ronald says, sustained behavior and attitudinal changes are difficult to trace or provide evidence for. Well, they're not impossible, but you have to have the time frame. And, you know, in countries where I've been trying to follow this Tostan intervention, you know, in, I don't know which country it was in Africa, around female circumcision. And I've always been curious about whether that was a short-term change, you know, everybody saying, oh, we're not going to circumcise our daughters, or whether it lasted. And actually, I've just ordered a book that seems to suggest that it lasted, you know, that it led to a fundamental change in those communities, in attitudes and behavior around female circumcision. But now we're going at it about 15 years later. So I think one could look, and, you know, the citation in the thing is about Weldon and Hutton's cross-country regression analysis that asks, what are the key factors that have driven progressive movement around violence against women? So that is then looking at, you know, so we have to have the different kinds of methodologies if we want to look at structural change. You know, people have looked at the way changes in family policy in Ethiopia have had very important impacts on young women going into the labor market, education, and so on. So, but if we stick to what works, and is there an RCT we can do on it, you have immediately contracted the range of interventions that you can look at. I think those all-women police stations, you know, I suppose you could randomize them, but it was a slightly odd thing to do. So I think it really is about methodologies and how much you are interested in bringing about long-term structural change.
Etienne, do you want to comment on that point and the extent to which when the team decided on the selection of interventions to be included, if you considered the type of evidence that would be available for those interventions?
Yes, sure. Well, that's definitely one of the challenges of any systematic review. I think it's establishing the list of criteria for what is in and what is out. Our focus in regards to study design has been to look at has been to look at rigorous methods for impact evaluation. So by rigorous methods, we hear here experimental. So as Nela mentioned, RCTs, randomized control trial, but also a set of quasi-experimental designs. And that's definitely something that we have identified through the review, is that a lot of work is done. And also coming back to what I said earlier, we integrate 104 studies, but let's remember that we integrate 104 studies, but we have screened 100,000 papers. So it means that there is so other many papers that have been excluded for, and one of the main reasons actually for exclusion has been the method used. And that's a challenge. I think that's a challenge that is raised in some of the impact evaluation we have encountered, how to rigorously analyze and assess the impact of an intervention focusing on empowerment. And that comes back to all this work and implication we have identified for research, where there is a need for standardization of indicators, but also a need to do more research following those rigorous methods to be able to analyze, okay, what works, what doesn't work, but not only that, how it works, why it works or why it doesn't work, or how can we improve it. I hope I addressed the question. And just taking benefits to complement one of the responses I gave earlier, there was a question about COVID. So COVID has been also an element that we have been interested in, but unfortunately, I think, once again, rigorous methods take time. So we are now just after the crisis, if I may say. Actually, the crisis is still pregnant in some countries, but I think we need a bit more time over the next few years to see impact evaluation using those rigorous methods, being gender transformative, gender specific, and looking at, okay, what has been the relation or the impact of COVID on those interventions. But that would definitely be an interesting element to look at in future research.
Nyla, did you want to come in?
Yes. I wanted to come in because one of the things that puzzled me in the review, and of course I haven't read the whole thing, I did try, but it was 600 pages long, and it would have taken quite a long time. But, you know, cash transfers have come up with, you know, some very positive impacts. But included in the impacts are those that I cannot see what the causal pathway was. So for instance, I think cash transfers have impact on political participation. Now, while I can understand how self-help groups might lead to that, because that's very much a part of the agenda of self-help groups, was it that there was not enough qualitative material that help us understand why a cash transfer to an individual person in a household should expand political participation? So that's one point. It's about, you know, causality, and to what extent this focus on rigor can, you know, one of the things that Pawson and Tilley, who've written about realist evaluations, has said is all kinds of information can be useful. You know, we don't have to only confine. I mean, I saw that you were quite strict even with the qualitative work, and I agree with you. There's a lot of qualitative work that you just don't know how they came up with what they did. But nevertheless, I think one could expand the range of studies that one looks at in order to understand causalities better. But the other thing, and perhaps this is to Henrietta, and I can understand why, you know, donor organizations, they need the evidence now because they have to act now. But I think there is scope for promoting studies like the Hutun and Weldon ones, or things that look at policy change, you know, things that are don't lend themselves to a what works agenda. So one could have a two-track strategy. You know, one track is what can we do right now, right? And the other track is what has made a sustained difference to women's lives in different parts of the world. And if a study tells us that promoting you know, autonomous women's groups has been the most important thing for bringing progressive change on violence against women, then it suggests that the donor community might want to start thinking about expanding its support for women's organizations and so on. So I'm just suggesting that there's a there's a time frame, the kind of time frame people work with. And I completely understand why people need things now, especially with COVID going on. But it shouldn't exclude the possibility of looking in a broader way at the things that bring about structural change, rather than, keep us at the level of everyday stuff.
Great, thanks, Nyla. Was there anyone else from the panel that wants to come in here, or shall we? Jana, yeah.
Yes, if I may, I'd like to come in on the issue of timeframes, and also this question of really tackling the root causes of conflict, the root causes of gender inequality, and the timeframe required for that, which normally goes well beyond the kind of 18 months, 2 months project timeframes, maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years, if on very rare occasions. And I think that comes also out in the studies and the review, that it's very hard to see that at the end of the causal chain any impact, because it's funding, short-term funding will just not reach it, much less if we do the immediate assessment and review directly after the project ends. So just to highlight, this time frame is something that we cannot, with all matter of effort, overcome. It is an issue of time, and both the project funding as well as the review time frame just needs to be commensurate with addressing these really deeply entrenched causes of social inequality. It's not a quick time fix. We can do quick things in 18 months, in 2 years, but you can't get to the root causes. That requires sustained interventions, tackling all the various components of gender inequality and empowerment. And another thing that came out in the review was the lack of the expected impact on reductions in IPV from some of the economic empowerment projects. And I'd like to again share one example of a project from International Alert in Tajikistan that had a really sustained approach at working both on economic income generation as well as reducing gender-based violence, especially intimate partner violence, through a sustained kind of dual approach of working in discussion groups with gender segregated groups, old men, older women, younger women in parallel, but on a similar curriculum, bringing them together at regular intervals to have that dialogue and really work through some of the issues that emerged as a group, as well as supporting economic income generating activities for the young women, especially these women from the smallest, from the poorest households, and raising their status in the family through the increased income that they were bringing. So this was really tackling things on several levels that had a very sustained impact. I will leave it there, but the point is to link up different levels of interventions and to really think in the long term, thinking of how we can work with all the actors. We cannot change the life chances or reduction in violence for young women if we don't work with the husbands and the father-in-laws and the broader social context.
So it looks like Henrietta wants to come in. I also wonder if, so we have a question which is about what are the study implications for donors, knowing that gender transformative change cannot happen in 1 to 1.5 year grant cycles. So if you want to comment on that.
Well, yes, sure. I mean, I would just very much underline Jana's points, because of course, I mean, it's not a single issue that one can tackle, in one intervention. And it doesn't mean, it's also the interventions we found here in the study. Of course, you always have to put it in a broader spectrum. And I guess, I mean, from a donor point of view, from BMZ, I can say, of course, we have a longer term perspective on a certain country. I mean, it's not only TDA as the unit I work in, Transitional Development Assistance, but of course, we are very much interlinked with our country teams. And we country teams that focus on the longer term development assistance, right? And of course, gender equality and women empowerment is of course a mainstreaming issue here at the ministry. And this goes for crisis or conflict countries as well as for other countries. And of course, we have a longer term vision, and our interventions from GDA, they run at least 3 to 5 years. And the bilateral development cooperation, they run even longer. So of course, this is not a quick fix, you know, and I think this is also what your findings suggest. It needs on different levels, on a governance level, on a regional level, on a local and individual level, you need to have interlinked interventions that go hand in hand, and they also strengthen each other, right? As Naila also said. So I'm totally with you here, and this also goes very much in line with all the HDP Nexus discussions, right? Because the humanitarian development peace nexus is something that is very at the heart of conflict and crisis countries, and this is one way of approaching these multi-crises contexts. And as you said, Jana, of course, we have from the humanitarian side, we often have very short-term interventions, but that need to be interlinked and supported and strengthened by other instruments as we do from the development side, and also from the social cohesion and peace building side, right? And I'm sure you're aware of the other systematic review that we have done together with 3IE in regard to social cohesion, which was published last year. And I think, of course, the time framing was one of the findings we had there as well. Short-term interventions are not going to be the solution for fragile contexts and for difficult social, social cohesion context. So, and I think for us, it will be also interesting maybe to put both systematic reviews together and see whether, I'm sure there are quite some interlinkages and also some, some double findings, because of course, social cohesion goes very much along with gender equality and women empowerment. So I think this would also be is something that we need to maybe deepen our discussion and see what linkages and findings we here have on both issues that we can combine in our programming.
Thanks, Henrietta. So I think perhaps we'll move on a little bit to some questions about the role and use of evidence more generally, and so not just relating to the details of the findings of the review. So I wonder whether really, and this is a question to all panelists, and based on your significant experience in the sector, whether you would like to highlight some good examples of evidence use, and also offer any reflections on what can be done to improve the use of evidence. So perhaps Sarah, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you so much. I think perhaps I'd like to go straight to the part about what we could perhaps consider to improve. I think, listening to this conversation, I also felt one of my reflections when I read the report was about timelines and about the way that we organize ourselves. And of course, as Henriette was reflecting, in a humanitarian or crisis setting, it's even more likely that we have a very short time to work. But I'm just wondering, how we can think about what we can extract from this kind of study, and then looking also maybe at some of the kind of reflection that Naila was talking about in terms of really looking at where we have the opportunity. And it's unusual, I think, of an organization like BRAC where we can look over a multi-generational time frame, but can we kind of extract some principles from that? Because I think that even when we have these realities that we have donor funding for 5 years, for 3 years, you know, and I can tell you like how many times I read project evaluations or even project reports, where you can see that the principal frustration of the people doing the work is, oh, we didn't have enough time, you know, we have we always link ourselves to these very ambitious goals, but we don't have time. And this is a constant experience of people in their work. So I'm just wondering, you know, how much we could extrapolate something at a higher level from both of those sort of sources and just give ourselves some kind of principles to work with, so that even where we do have a shorter time, we can, you know, apply those. And I think that it would be great to have more discussion and agreement around that. And then I think, you know, perhaps it's also, as an organization that's often working with partners, I have to reflect for myself about the thing we should have and what we expect from partners. You know, sometimes we give people money for a year and then we ask them to say they're going to change a community. You know, and I mean, sometimes we create a situation. I think we have to, I must see myself as part of that, where people are asked to claim they can do things that they can't do, you know, and I think that having this kind of organizing framework would perhaps help with that as well. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sarah. Naila, would you like to go next?
Okay. Just on that, Sarah, I think one of the interesting studies that the long-term impacts is an evaluation done on the daughters of Progressa, you know, daughters of one of the earliest cash transfers. And it found that the daughters of women who had benefited from the cash transfer reported going up the occupational hierarchy in the labor market relative to their mothers. So, you know, there we have a case of a longer term impact, that whatever happened under the Progressa thing. So I think, you know, those, and we've now been experimenting, or, you know, we've had sufficient interventions to bring in some of those lessons. And I think the other question that you asked, Berta, is that, you know, what makes for good evidence? You know, how does it get taken up by policymakers? And I think this, what Etienne kind of concluded with, the importance of mixed methods. Because I think the importance of mixed methods lies in not throwing sand in people's eyes, you know, not saying, oh, well, you know, we found that the impact was 50% more significant for this group, but the qualitative stuff will tell you under what circumstances did that impact materialize. And therefore, people will start to understand better how social change operates on the ground, and that it doesn't operate in the same way everywhere. So you could have quite standardized, you know, RCT type things, but it is the qualitative stuff that grounds those findings in local context. And I think it is imperative for donors, you know, people who are involved in financing some of this, to understand how change takes place in these different places and why it doesn't happen in certain places, in spite of it being successful somewhere else. So I think that's a kind of a partnership between researchers, implementers, and funders, a kind of a joint learning process, you know.
Thanks, Naila. Jana, do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you. I think I'll speak to an example of good evidence in the sector that I'd like to mention from Inclusive Peace, predecessor IPTI study on the contribution to the 2015 Global Women, Peace and Security Study on making women count, which compiled a lot of evidence that really informed a bit of a shifting the needle in the approaches, beyond always shouting for women's seat at the table to asking much more critically who is sitting at that table, what is discussed at the table, and does a woman being in that seat necessarily mean the issue of gender will get raised or raised effectively, or that other participants at the table listen to these points being made? So it's that not new, but a very much ongoing challenge of how you make representation meaningful, how you get beyond pure representation, tokenistic box ticking. There was a woman in the room, we can tick that, to how do you get gender issues really discussed properly and how do you get to inclusive outcomes, not just a box ticking around the table. And one of the examples, I think that is a little behind the times, but in some of the ongoing negotiations with the Taliban before the situation in Afghanistan changed, there was a lot of emphasis from certain people they have to bring at least 2 women to the table. Now, whether they would have brought 2 women or not to that table, how much significant impact would have had on gender dynamics in the country? Would the efforts have been more useful in looking at how to influence towards inclusive outcomes of the discussion? Also thinking, so it's a little bit going back on that recommendation to give women a seat at the table. Yes, always a valid, important goal in itself, but also beyond that, challenge ourselves to look at how do we get to inclusive outcomes in these negotiations. We're looking at the piece that we want to support, the peaceful societies, the inclusive societies that we want to see at the end of that.
Thanks, Jana. And Henriette, do you want to come in?
Well, thanks. Well, I would like to underline again Nyla's comments on the different levels of approach we need, I guess. And of course, I would come to the question of what can be done, right, to improve the use of evidence, but also how can we facilitate more robust evidence. And of course, as a donor we also have the duty and the willingness also to fund studies like this, like the systematic review. But we also very much in favor of funding robust evaluation itself. So, for example, and this is still very new, really. Also at the BMZ, there is not a lot of rigorous evidence going on at the moment, but we have at the moment 4 running joint programs with WFP and UNICEF in the Sahel region. It's a Sahel resilience program, and we have a huge rigorous evidence program alongside with it, and this is very new also to the BMZ, I have to say. So of course, we want to bring in some more innovative ideas, and we hope that other divisions and other teams here in our in the BMZ will follow. So we are promoting this, of course, but also we give a lot of signals to our partners. And I guess also there, we still have to see that the capacities are very different in between the United Nations, different organizations, but also NGOs. Some have a very strong learning tool, really, in to digest evidence that is there, that they're creating maybe on their own, but also to digest evidence that is that comes from scientific organizations. But I have the feeling that there's still a way to go, well, we try to have a very strong dialogue and to promote those robust evidence with our partners. But I guess, as Nala said, you need some knowledge, some knowledge cycle and some knowledge process to really digest the evidence that there is already, and of course also to see and to digest the new evidence that is coming in.
Excellent, thank you. So there are a couple of questions that I'd like to direct to the team that are coming up from the audience, a bit more specific questions. So one is, could you please elaborate a bit more about the part of inclusive community-driven development, community dialogue and reconciliation, discussion groups and safe spaces, and the effect on the achievement dimension? And in particular, if there are findings from the qualitative research that say something about under which circumstances these approaches appear to be more effective. And then there is also a question around measurement of women's empowerment. Many studies include indices for measuring this outcome. How relevant are these indices? So Shannon from the study team is also highlighting that we found that about 75% of the studies measured empowerment using an author-created scale. So that is initially, if Etienne, if you can respond to those questions, but I'd also invite the rest of the panel to particularly come in about this issue of indices and how to address the apparent mushrooming of different indices. Over to you, Etienne.
Yes, so I will actually, if you don't mind, I will start with the first question and then move to the indices. So
yeah.
Then the rest, yeah. So on the first question that was about those type of intervention and their impact on achievements. So the first element I will highlight is that some of these interventions actually didn't have enough evidence in the qualitative aspect to actually be able to do a qualitative analysis. So my comments will come on those that had these elements. So the main ones being inclusive, community-driven development, and the other one, safe spaces. So they were quite different in those aspects, but they have some points in common. So on the community-driven development, actually one of the main effects of community-driven development has been increasing the participation, or in terms of achievement, increasing the participation of women in those political institutions. But as we said earlier, and I used this example earlier, the participation is not always enough. If we want actually women to have their say in the decision making, there is a need, and that's what the qualitative documentation tells us, for capacity building within those institutions to allow basically women to participate, but also working with those institutions to change not only their attitudes, as we said earlier, but their behavior. So there is all this work on involving the institutions, working with those institutions for them to actually be an actor of this inclusiveness. Then when it comes to the safe spaces, actually safe spaces has been one of those interventions where we're expecting actually more of an impact, of significant impact, but actually only observed impact on safe spaces in the resources aspect. And one of the elements that we identify as a driver of success or an enabler of impact is this peer-to-peer and working with local role models that will inspire, not only in terms of creating a shelter, but also using this shelter as a space to build capacities, build trust, build confidence that then will impact the rest of the community. So these are some elements that we identified on those types of interventions. Moving to
Can I ask you a question, please, just before we move on? When you talked about safe spaces and very limited impacts, was it that the studies restricted themselves to limited impacts and they were not significant, and they were significant or whatever? So I'm asking, is the absence of any range of impacts a product of the questions that were asked by those studies?
So I think that's, I think we have lost someone. No, I think that's probably a question that maybe my colleagues on the chat will be better able to answer, because they will have the possibility to actually go back to the study and count the number of outcomes measured through safe spaces. But actually, if I remember well, and I hope not to say anything wrong, but if I remember well, safe spaces were actually measuring quite a high number of our list of outcomes. And many times we're actually not meeting the significant effectiveness. But I will let my colleagues on the chat look in the study and probably provide with the additional details on this question. In regards to the indices, that's true. That's what my colleague Shannon on the chat started to explain, is that we have found, actually, I would say maybe 3 types of indices when it comes to gender, to women's empowerment. So first type is those general indices that will provide some elements of, okay, what are the measurements of empowerment in general, but not always gender specific. What they are measuring is empowerment. So how can we translate these empowerment aspects into gender or women's empowerment? The second types of indices that we found are women's empowerment in a specific context. So, for example, we'll have indices on empowerment in agriculture, empowerment in the work in the private sector, etc. And the third type of indices that we found, that's the one Shannon mentioned on the chat, is that actually for many of the studies in, I don't remember the percentage, but I think Shannon put it on the chat, 75% of the studies actually use indices that they create themselves through what the aspects of empowerment they're measuring. And that's why in our implication, we were calling for a standardization, because this will facilitate the comparison between studies if they are looking at the same set of criteria. But we also understand that that might be very challenging, because from one situation to another, from one type of intervention to another, we might be looking at different types of outcomes. So that's true that this question of the indices and how to measure empowerment is a challenge. And that's a challenge that is actually shared by the different studies that we've been looking at, and that has been, that we see mentioned in the different papers.
So is this, do any of the other panelists want to respond to this question? Perhaps Naila, if I can, because I think this type of finding around measurements and is something that we see across different reviews, and it's a problem for how much we can learn, but it's also challenging in terms of the extent to which we are using validated outcome measures. Do you have any thoughts on what might encourage researchers, for example, to draw on existing tools and insights to why there is this sense that academics invent new indices for every new study?
Well, I'm very conflicted. Am I on? Yes. I'm very conflicted about standardized measures versus context-specific measures, right? Because I can see the utility of standardized measures. You know, this worked here, did it work equally there, and so on. So there's a a place for this. But then circumstances vary, context vary, the pathways to empowerment will vary. So I wonder if we're not overloading people by saying perhaps you should have both. So perhaps you could have. I know that some of the people have developed a Women in Agriculture Empowerment Index, and they have now moved into the subcategories of that very composite measures. So you're allowed to, you can go a bit more disaggregated. So, I think I'm reluctant to impose the same measure for everyone, but one could think of certain elements, like violence against women, that sort of seems to be fairly universal, and one could incorporate it with other things. Has this intervention managed to touch these elements of the processes that lead to violence? So not reduced or eliminated violence. So all I'm saying is, for purposes of comparison, you would want these measures that have been, properly validated and so on. But for purposes of understanding, I think you would want to stay with measures that have been developed, generated out of an understanding of local contexts. I don't suppose that's a very satisfactory answer, but that's what I would do.
I think that's very helpful. Thanks, Naila. And so we're nearly out of time. So I would like to, first of all, say thank you to Etienne and Jana, Naila, Sarah, and Henriette for your contributions today. I'm not going to try and summarize the key takeaways from what I think has been a really rich and interesting discussion. But I think, Sarah, in your comments, you made the observation that this type of study often it's also raising a lot of questions. And so I think that, and hope that this is the start of a discussion. I think that there are implications to be worked through, both when it comes to implications for policy and practice, and in further interpreting the findings from the review. And I think that the panel, you've provided some good suggestions in that regard. And also implications for research, including the last point that we discussed around indices, but also the point about the type of methods that are used to study the type of interventions covered in the review and the interventions that are not covered in the review. So I hope that this is the beginning of a discussion to be continued. And to our audience, thank you so much for tuning in and for asking thoughtful questions. Have a good day, everyone.